The field stretched out under the scorching Texas sky, where the fiery red sun hung like a dying ember. The wind swept through, carrying red dust from the winding dirt road that snaked across John Carver's old farm. The rotting wooden planks on the fence creaked, as if they were recounting days long forgotten. In the midst of this scene, John stood silently, his frail shadow stretching long on the ground. One hand held a worn hammer, while the other gently tapped on the wooden post he had just driven in. His deep blue eyes, clouded by age, gazed far into the horizon, where sparse clouds drifted lazily, seemingly indifferent to the passage of time. John Carver wasn't much of a talker. The folks around here, if they remember him at all, just know he's an old man living alone in that run-down farm. There are rumors that he once had a family, but no one has seen his wife or kids. Maybe they left, or maybe time has erased all traces of them. Now, John's only companion is Rusty, an old mixed-breed dog with scruffy gray coat and floppy ears. Rusty sprawls out on the porch, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor every time John walks by. "It's pretty quiet today, isn't it, buddy?" John mutters, his voice raspy like it's been dried out by the Texas dust. Rusty just yawns, too uninterested to reply. But that silence didn't last long. From a distance, the roar of an engine shattered the stillness. An old, battered black truck came barreling down the dusty road. Following it were two other pickup trucks, their tires grinding against the ground, leaving behind long, jagged tracks. John paused, slowly turning his head to look. He squinted, trying to see through the thick cloud of dust rising up. The vehicles came to a stop right in front of the farm, just a few dozen feet away from him. The door swung open, and a group of 5 men stepped out, all tall and menacing, their faces grimy and their clothes caked with dirt. The leader is Carlos El Toro Mendoza, a man in his 40s with a bald head and a scar running from his eyebrow down to his left cheek. He wears a black leather jacket, a lit cigar dangling from his mouth, and his cold, sharp eyes scan the farm like a predator. Following Carlos are 4 henchmen: Diego, a lanky guy with yellow teeth; Paco, big and fat, always grinning wickedly; Luis, quiet but with a gaze full of malice; and finally Miguel, the youngest, with dyed blue hair, constantly fiddling with a switchblade in his hand. They aren't locals. Their speech is laced with Spanish, and the way they move makes it clear they come from across the border, where the law is just a joke. "Look at this place." Paco burst out laughing, his high-pitched voice echoing across the field. "I swear, I've never seen a farm this pathetic. It looks like it's about to collapse any minute." Diego nodded, spitting a wad of saliva onto ground. Must be the home of some old geezers on their last legs. Nobody gives a damn. Carlos didn't say a word, just puffed on a cigar, his eyes glued to John. He raised his hand to signal his goons to be quiet, then stepped closer, his leather shoes thudding heavily against the ground. John stood still. He remained there, hammer in hand, his calm gaze fixed on the group of strangers. Carlos stopped a few steps away, bending down to look John straight in the eye. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice low but menacing. "Is this your land?" John nodded slowly, not responding. Carlos scoffed, turning to his henchman. "Did you hear that? It's his land. But from now on, it's ours too. Got it?" Paco burst out laughing, slapping Miguel on the shoulder. "Look at that old man. He's probably so scared he's about to wet his pants. He's so weak. What can he do to me?" Miguel flicked open his pocket knife, spinning it between his fingers like he was putting on a show. I bet he wouldn't dare make a sound. One punch, and he'd be flat on the ground. Luis, the quietest one, stood with his arms crossed, eyeing John from head to toe. He frowned slightly, as if he sensed something was off, but then shook his head, thinking he was just imagining things. Carlos turned back to John, his voice growing colder. "Listen here, old man. We need this place to work. Just stay inside your house and don't interfere with us, and everything will be fine. But if you keep dragging your feet," he paused, pulling a dagger from his belt and stabbing it forcefully into a nearby wooden post. The blade sank deep into the wood, vibrating slightly. "Then you won't have this farm to fix up anymore." John still didn't say anything. He just stared at Carlos, then slowly turned back and continued hammering the stake into the wood as if nothing had happened. The The gang of thugs burst into laughter, their voices echoing in the dry, hot air. "See? I told you," Paco shouted. "The old man is scared to death." Diego clapped his hands, while Miguel jumped up on the hood of the car, yelling, "This place is ours now. Old man, you hear me?" But in that moment, as Carlos turned his back and walked toward the car, John subtly lifted his head. A glint sparked in his eyes, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, sharp as a knife in the darkness. Rusty, the old dog lying on the porch, suddenly perked up, ears erect, letting out a low growl. The wind stopped blowing, and the air felt heavier. Carlos didn't see it, nor did the henchman notice. But the audience would feel it. Something was beginning, slowly but surely, like a storm quietly brewing on the horizon. The sun had completely dipped below the horizon, leaving the Texas sky a deep, inky black, punctuated only by a few faint stars. John Carver's farm now lay shrouded in darkness, the oil lamp hanging from the porch of the wooden house flickering like a flame on the verge of going out. The night wind began to pick up, swirling red dust and the creaking sounds from the rotting boards of the fence, from the direction of the farm gate. The hoarse laughter of the gang's thugs echoed, mingling with the rumble of a truck engine still running. They had just arrived, but acted as if this place had been theirs for a long time. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza leaned against the hood of a battered black pickup truck, a cigar burning brightly in his hand, with wisps of white smoke swirling in the dry air. He wore a black leather jacket, his bald head glinting under the headlights, and his cold, sharp eyes scanned the field like a predator assessing its prey. "All right, you guys," Carlos barked, his deep voice resonating with authority, overpowering the sound of the wind. "Get the stuff out of the truck. You have 1 hour to hide all this cargo before we head back to the border. Move it, don't dawdle." The henchman nodded vigorously, starting to haul heavy burlap sacks out of the truck bed. The rustling fabric and the clinking metal made it clear, without even looking, that inside were illegal goods, the very reason they risked everything to cross the border. Diego, a scrawny guy with yellow teeth, dragged a heavy sack out of the truck, cursing loudly as he pulled. "Damn it! This thing is heavy as hell. What the hell did those guys at the border stuff in here? Rocks." He huffed and puffed, sweat streaming down his gaunt face. Paco, the chubby one, chuckled heartily and slapped Diego on the back so hard that he nearly toppled over. "If you're weak, quit whining, you idiot. This is money. Once we stash this away, you and I can spend like crazy, hit the bar for a whole week if we want." Miguel, the youngest with bright green hair, jumped down from the truck's hood, twirling a pocket knife in his hand like it was a toy. "I just hope that old man doesn't drag his feet," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I'm itching to try this knife out. It's been too long since I've cut anything worth a damn." Luis, the quietest of the bunch, said nothing, just silently hefted another sack, his cold gaze sweeping through the darkness as if he were calculating something. John Carver stood several dozen feet away, holding a hammer that had slipped from his grip at some point. He didn't move forward or backward. He just quietly observed a group of strangers with an oddly calm demeanor. The oil lamp light from the porch cast a glow on his face, highlighting the deep wrinkles, his tousled gray hair, and his blue eyes, which seemed to shine brighter in the darkness. Rusty, the loyal old dog, had left the porch and quietly walked over to stand beside John. He didn't bark or growl anymore. He simply looked at the strangers with sorrowful gaze, his tail gently thumping against the ground like a silent warning. Carlos glanced at John, a sneer curling his lips. "Look at that old man," he said to his goons, his tone dripping with disdain. "I bet he's praying we don't burn down his rickety chicken coop. What a loser. Living here must just be waiting to die." The goons erupted in laughter, their voices echoing in the stillness of the field. Paco stepped closer to the fence, pointing at John as if teasing him. "Hey, old man, stop standing there staring. Go inside, shut the door, and pretend we're not here. Got it? Or do you need me to come over and teach you how to listen?" Miguel flicked open his knife, the steel glinting in the headlights. "Or I could just come over and have some fun with you. I really like stubborn old men." John didn't respond. He simply lowered his head slightly, as if lost in thought, then slowly turned and walked toward the wooden house. His thin frame moved slowly, looking just like a frail old man resigned to his fate. The group of henchmen laughed even louder, their laughter drowning out the sound of the night wind blowing across the fields. "See? I told you so," Paco shouted, clapping his hands together. "The old man is so scared he can't even make a sound. What a coward!" Diego spat on the ground, nodding in agreement. "Guys like him just sit around waiting to die. They can't do anything to us." But when John stepped up the door of the house, he froze. His hand gripped the doorknob tightly, his bony fingers squeezing so hard that the knuckles turned white. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to catch every sound from behind him. The voices of the henchmen were still ringing out, now shifting to discussions about hiding the goods. "Dig a hole behind the chicken coop," Carlos ordered, his voice colder than before. "Hurry up! Don't leave any traces. Once we finish this, we still have to deliver the shipment in El Paso before morning." Diego grumbled, but he still hoisted the shovel onto his shoulder and trudged toward the old chicken coop tucked away in the corner of the farm. "The ground's as hard as rock. How am I supposed to dig?" he muttered, but he still began to plunge the shovel into the earth. John pushed the door open and stepped inside, but instead of closing it like the henchman expected, he left it slightly ajar. Inside, the flickering oil lamp cast a dim light on the faded wooden walls, covered in the dust of time. A small table stood in the middle of the room, cluttered with a few old items: a shattered radio, a tattered notebook with yellowed pages, and a rusted military badge. John approached the table, his hand trembling as it brushed against the badge. Memories flooded back, gunfire ringing out in the night, the shouts of his comrades amidst the smoke and flames, and the faces of those he had once confronted, those he had taken down. His eyes, once clouded by age, now sparkled strangely, like a flame that had just been reignited after years buried beneath a layer of ashes. Outside, the henchmen had started digging a hole. The sound of shovels hitting the ground echoed steadily, mixed with Diego's curses every time sweat dripped into his eyes. "Damn it! The ground is as hard as rock. Why did we pick an easier spot?" he growled, throwing the shovel down to wipe his face. Paco leaned against the fence, smirking. "If you're weak, just quit. Let me handle it. What kind of man are you, all weak like that?" Miguel squatted nearby, fiddling with a knife, his gaze absent-mindedly drifting toward the wooden house. "I find that old man really strange," he muttered, his voice low but loud enough for Luis to hear. "He's not scared like the others I've met." Luis, the quiet one, turned to look at Miguel and nodded slightly. "I see it too, but whatever. He can't do anything to us. What can he do all by himself?" Carlos stood a few meters away, watching the group with an expressionless face. He took one last puff from his cigar, then tossed it to the ground, crushing it under his heel until the embers went out completely. "Hurry up!" he barked, his voice laced with impatience. "I don't want to be stuck in this godforsaken place any longer than necessary. Once you're done hiding everything, let's get out of here without leaving a trace." But as he turned to look at the wooden house, he froze. The door was still ajar, and in the darkness, he caught a glimpse of John Carver standing there, motionless, not in fear, not begging, just an eerie stillness, like a predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. The night wind howled stronger, carrying a bone-chilling cold from the fields. Rusty, the old dog, lifted his head and let out a low growl. It was a soft growl, but enough to startle Miguel, causing the knife in his hand to nearly slip from his grip. "Damn it, what's that dog doing?" he cursed, springing to his feet. Carlos raised his hand to signal him to be quiet, his eyes still glued to the house. "Pay attention," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, cold as the night breeze. "Something's not right here. I can feel it. The audience will feel the rhythm building." The initial arrogance of the gang starts to give way to a hint of doubt, even though they don't fully realize it yet. John Carver, the frail old man in their eyes, is quietly shifting the atmosphere. The storm hasn't hit yet, but dark clouds are beginning to gather, thicker than ever in the dry Texas sky. Inside John Carver's old wooden house, the space was bathed in the dim light of a lantern hanging on the wall. The night wind howled through the cracks in the wooden planks, carrying the biting cold of the Texas plains. John stood still by the small table in the middle of the room, his hand still touching the rusted military badge, a piece of memory he had long tried to bury. Outside, the rhythmic sound of shovels and the gang's lackeys echoed steadily, mixed with Diego's curses and Paco's raspy laughter. They were digging a hole behind the chicken coop, completely unaware that John's door was still ajar, and the old man they looked down upon was listening intently to every sound. John gently lifted the badge, turning it between his rugged fingers. The oil lamp's light reflected off the metal surface, highlighting the eagle and the faded inscription, Special Forces. He said nothing, but his lips were pressed tight, and his deep blue eyes were now as sharp as a blade. Old memories flooded back, not like a torrent, but like droplets slowly seeping through the dust of time. Gunfire echoed in the desert night. The shouts of comrades pierced through the smoke and flames, and the faces of those he once faced flashed before him, only to fade away, leaving behind a mix of emptiness and resolve. He set the badge down on the table, the soft clink of metal against what sounding like a reminder that the past never truly leaves. Rusty, the old dog, stood next to John, his ears drooping but perking up slightly with every sound from the gang outside. He didn't growl anymore, but the way he tilted his head toward the door showed he was on high alert. John leaned down and gently stroked Rusty's head. "You hear that too, don't you?" he muttered, his voice rough like it had been dried out by the Texas dust. "They think this is their home now." Rusty thumped his tail softly against the floor, as if agreeing with his owner. John straightened up and walked over to the small window next to the front door. He pulled aside the old, tattered curtain just enough to peek outside without being seen. Outside, Carlos El Toro, Mendoza's henchmen, were still hard at work. Diego, the scrawny one, threw his shovel down and wiped the sweat from his brow with his tattered sleeve. "Damn it! I swear this ground is harder than that idiot Paco's head," he grumbled, his voice full of frustration. Paco, the chubby one, leaned against the fence, chuckling to himself. "What did you say about me, you sewer rat? Dig faster, or I'll have to do it myself." Miguel, the guy with the green hair, squatted nearby, flipping a pocket knife in his hand, his gaze absent-mindedly drifting toward the wooden house. "I still find that old man really strange," he muttered, his voice low but loud enough for Luis to hear. "He's not scared, doesn't run, doesn't beg. Normal people don't act like that." Luis, the quiet one, glanced over at Miguel and nodded slightly. "I noticed too, but he's all alone. What can we do to him?" Carlos stood a few steps away, his leather shoes thudding against the ground as he paced back and forth, eyeing the group. He had just extinguished a cigar, and now his hand was shoved deep into his leather jacket pocket, his face expressionless but his eyes betraying a hint of impatience. "Hurry up, you bunch of idiots," he barked. "I don't want to be stuck in this godforsaken place any longer than necessary. Once we stash the goods, we need to haul over to El Paso before dawn." He turned his head toward the wooden house, and in that moment, he felt a chill run down his spine. The door was still ajar, and even though he couldn't see clearly, he knew John Carver was there, lurking somewhere in the shadows. John, from inside, watched everything through the gap in the curtain. He saw Diego swinging a pickaxe into the ground, chunks of red earth flying everywhere. He saw Paco leaning against the fence, laughing and joking as if this were their backyard. He saw Miguel fiddling with a knife, the steel glinting each time it turned. And he saw Carlos, the bald guy with a scar on his face, standing there like he was the king of this land. John didn't say a word, but his hand tightened into a fist, the knuckles cracking ominously. He knew they were without needing to ask. The Mexican gang, those who crossed the border to deal in illicit goods, leaving blood and tears in their wake. He had encountered guys like this before many times. In the years he tried to forget, but this time is different. This isn't the deserts of the Middle East or the jungles of South America where he once fought. This is his home, the land he chose to rest on, to live out his remaining days in peace. And now, they are invading it, laughing on his very soil, as if he's nothing more than a useless old man. John takes a deep breath, his breath slow but heavy. He's not a hot-headed man. He never has been. But the way they act, the way they look down on him, is awakening something inside, something he's tried to suppress for so many years. Rusty let out a soft whine, as if sensing the shift in the air. John turned to look at the dog, offering a faint smile that was subtle yet meaningful. "Easy, Rusty," he said, his voice dropping. "It's not time yet." He walked over to the old wooden chair by the table and sat down slowly. His hands rested on his knees, but his gaze remained fixed on the window. He wasn't in a hurry, not resisting at least, not yet, but the audience could feel, through his every small movement, that this was not submission. This was the patience of a seasoned man, someone who knew exactly who he was up against and understood precisely what he could do. Outside, Diego finally finished digging the hole. He threw the shovel down and gasped for breath. "Done, damn it. Now let's shove this stuff in." Paco sauntered over, dragging a sack closer. "You're working like a laborer, Diego. Look at me. I can do this twice as fast." Miguel scoffed, getting up from his spot. "Sure, you're fast, but are you sure the cops aren't going to show up? I've heard they've been patrolling a lot lately." Carlos turned around, his voice as cold as ice. "There aren't any cops around. This place is too far out, too remote. That's why I picked it." But when Carlos said that, John, from inside the house, subtly curled his lip, a small smile, almost unnoticed, but enough for the audience to understand that he knew something they didn't. His gaze was sharper than ever, like a blade that had just been honed. The night wind blew through, causing the slightly ajar door to tremble, and that faint sound was like the first warning not for John, but for those standing on his land. The oil lamp in John Carver's wooden house flickered softly, casting a pale yellow light on his face, highlighting the rugged features and his once blue eyes now sharp as a freshly honed blade. Outside, the sound of shovels had completely stopped. Diego had just finished digging the hole behind the chicken coop, while Carlos El Toro Mendoza's henchmen were unloading bags of contraband from the truck, getting ready to bury them in the ground. Paco's raucous laughter echoed through the darkness, mixed with Diego's curses and Miguel's mumbling about the pocket knife he kept spinning in his hand. They still believed everything was under control, still thought that John, the old man sitting in the ramshackle wooden house, was nothing more than a harmless ghost. John sat on the old wooden chair, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his eyes glued to the gap in the curtain. He could see every move they made, Paco lazily dragging a sack, Diego panting heavily by the hole in Luis, the quiet one, carefully checking each bag before tossing it down. Carlos stood a few steps away, his leather shoes thudding loudly against the ground as he paced back and forth, his voice cold and cutting. "Hurry up, you idiots! Get it hidden and pack it up. I don't want to leave any traces here." John subtly curled his lips into a smile, now a bit clearer, but still holding something that the henchman couldn't grasp. He turned to look at Rusty, the old dog still standing by his side, ears perked up slightly as if waiting for a command. "Can you believe how stupid they are?" John muttered, his voice hoarse yet laced with a hint of cold humor. "They think I don't know what they're up to." Rusty let out a soft whine, his tail gently thumping against the wooden floor in agreement. John stood up and slowly walked over to the small wooden shelf in the corner of the room. On the shelf was an old wooden box, its surface scratched and covered in dust. He opened the lid, revealing things that no one in this remote land would ever expect. A military knife, a stopwatch that had long stopped ticking, and a small, neatly folded map, marked with red ink at points only he understood. John picked up the dagger, its blade still sharp despite the decades that had passed. He twirled it in his hand, feeling a familiar weight of the tool that had been his companion on missions even his teammates dared not speak of. He didn't intend to use it, not yet, but just touching it was enough to awaken the instincts that had lain dormant within him. He set the dagger down and pulled out the map, spreading it across the table. The red ink traced the land around the chicken coop, the fence, and the dirt road leading to the highway. This wasn't just his home. It was a battlefield he had long prepared for, even though he hoped he would never have to use it. Outside, the henchman had finished hiding the first bag. Diego covered the hole with dirt, grumbling as he worked. "Damn it! After this, I'm going to need a beer. I'm exhausted." Paco scoffed, tossing another bag down. "You want a beer? Once we're done, I'm the one who deserves it, you weakling." Miguel stood up from his spot, the pocket knife still spinning in his hand. He stepped closer to Carlos, lowering his voice. "Boss, I still think something's off here. That old man. I don't like the way he's looking at us. Carlos turned around, narrowing his eyes at Miguel. What are you worried about? He's all alone, no gun, nothing. You really think he dared do anything to us? But when Carlos said that, he accidentally glanced over at the wooden house. The door was still ajar, and in the darkness, he caught a glimpse of John's eyes not through the window, but from the very crack of the door, a gaze that didn't blink, that showed no fear, just a chilling stillness like the Texas sky before a storm. Carlos froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the dagger strapped to his belt. "Luis," he called, his voice dropping low. "Go check around here and see if anything's off. I don't want any surprises." Luis nodded, quietly stepping out of the headlights, disappearing into the darkness of the field. John saw Luis moving, but he didn't budge. He folded the map, put it back in the box, and sat down in a chair. He knew they were suspicious, even if just a little. He wanted them to be suspicious. That was the first step. He didn't need to act right away, didn't need to resist. Guys like Carlos, like this bunch of lackeys, always dug their own graves when they got too cocky. John had seen it hundreds of times before, and now he just needed to sit still, watch, and wait. The night wind blew stronger, causing the curtain and the slightly open door to flutter. Rusty lifted his head, letting out a low growl. John raised his hand to signal him to be quiet, his gaze still fixed outside. He didn't say a word, but the audience could feel, through his silence and that piercing look, that this was not an act of surrender. This was the beginning of a game that only John knew the rules to. John Carver's wooden house was still bathed in the dim light of the oil lamp, but the atmosphere inside was heavier now, as if each breath he took carried an unspoken intention. John sat in an old wooden chair, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his deep blue eyes fixed on a gap in the curtain. Outside, the sound of Carlos El Toro, Mendoza's henchman, echoed the rustling of disturbed earth, the thud of smuggled goods being tossed into a pit, and the back-and-forth bickering between Diego and Paco. But now, there was a new sound. The footsteps of Luis, the silent one, quietly moving around the farm under Carlos's orders. John heard it all, and the corners of his mouth curled up not in a cheerful smile, but in the knowing grin of a man who understood the game had begun. Rusty, the old dog, lay at John's feet, his floppy ears twitching slightly every time Luis's footsteps drew closer. John reached down and gently stroked his head. "Don't worry," he murmured, his voice hoarse yet reassuring. "They don't know who we are yet." He stood up and slowly walked over to the wooden shelf where an old box remained open. The military knife and the small map he had just looked over were still there, like pieces of the past he couldn't and now didn't want to deny. He picked up the map once more, unfolding it under the glow of the oil lamp. The red markings circling the farm weren't just random symbols. They were strategic points he had drawn long ago when he decided to turn this place into his final fortress. Outside, Luis had circled around the back of the chicken coop, his cold eyes scanning the darkness. He stopped near the fence, picking up a small piece of metal, a rusty nail, perhaps dropped from the wooden post that John had fixed earlier in the afternoon. Luis frowned, turning it over in his hand before slipping it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what it meant, but the instincts of a seasoned survivor in the underground world made him feel uneasy. He moved on, checking around the area of the chicken coop, where Diego had just finished hiding the last sack. "All done," Diego shouted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Now let me take a break. Damn it." Paco scoffed, patting Diego on the shoulder. "A break? You act like you just ran a marathon. You're such a wuss." Carlos stood close to the truck, his gaze fixed on the wooden house. He couldn't hear Luis, but he knew the guy was working. "Miguel," he called, his voice dropping. "Go help Luis. I want to make sure this place is clean before we leave." Miguel nodded, spinning his pocket knife one last time in his hand before tucking away and stepping out of the headlights. He muttered, "I still don't trust that old man. Something's off." Carlos didn't respond, but his grip tightened around the dagger strapped to his waist. John, from inside the house, heard the second set of footsteps Miguel had entered the scene. He folded the map, placed it back in the box, and walked over to the window. He didn't pull the curtains again. He just stood there, letting his shadow blend into the darkness. He saw Louis circling around the chicken coop, noticed Miguel approaching from the direction of the fence. They were checking things out, feeling suspicious. Just as he wanted. He didn't need to do anything yet. Not at this moment. Their suspicion was the first weapon he wielded, and he knew how to let it grow, quietly but irresistibly. He turned back to sit down in the chair, his hands clasped together. Memories from the past flooded back, this time clearer than ever. He remembered the last time he faced a gang like this. Not in America, but in a dusty village across the border. They were just as confident, just as arrogant, until he turned that village into a trap from which no one escaped. John wasn't proud of those days, but he had no regrets. And now, as Carlos's henchmen encroached on his territory, he felt a familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through him, not anger, but absolute focus. Outside, Luis and Miguel met near the chicken coop. "Find anything?" Miguel asked, his voice low but tense. Luis shook his head, pulling a rusty nail out of his pocket. "Just this. I don't know what it means." Miguel frowned, glancing toward the wooden house. "I swear I saw that old man watching us. Not in a scared way, but like he knows something." Luis didn't respond, but his gaze also drifted toward the house. The door was still ajar, and even though they couldn't see clearly, both felt an invisible pressure coming from it. Carlos, from the back of the truck, shouted, "Are you two done yet?" Stop standing there daydreaming. Luis and Miguel turned around and walked toward the headlights. "Nothing, boss," Luis said, his voice flat. "I must be imagining things." But as he said that, he didn't believe himself. Carlos nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the wooden house. "Good. Clean up quickly and let's go. I don't want any trouble." John heard those words, and a sharp, dangerous glint flashed in his eyes, though it remained hidden beneath his calm demeanor. He stood up, walked to the door, and placed his hand on the doorknob. He didn't open it further, nor did he close it. He just stood there, peering outside through the crack. He saw Carlos ordering his goons to get in the car, watched them getting ready to leave. But he knew they would come back. They always came back when they thought everything was safe. And when that time came, he would be ready. The night wind howled, shaking the door and the curtain. Rusty lifted his head, letting out a low growl. John smiled for the first time that night, a genuine smile. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice deep, like a whisper to the darkness. The Texas sky had turned pitch black, with not a single star in sight, as if all of nature was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. John Carver's farm now lay eerily quiet. The sound of shovels digging, the swearing, and the raucous laughter of the gang's goons had completely stopped. They had left a few hours ago, leaving behind a hole behind the chicken coop, carefully covered with dirt, beneath which lay bags of contraband they believed would be safe until their return. But now, as the clock struck midnight, the roar of a truck engine rumbled in the distance, shattering the stillness of fields. Carlos El Toro Mendoza sat in the driver's seat, his narrow eyes squinting through the dusty windshield. He had just received word from a middleman in El Paso. The goods they had hidden on the farm needed to be moved immediately. The customer was getting anxious. He had come back here with his crew Diego, Paco, Luis, and Miguel to plan to dig it up, do a quick check, and then haul the goods away before dawn. But as the truck pulled up to the farm gate, the headlights sweeping over the hole behind chicken coop, Carlos felt his heart skip a beat. The dirt was still there, but something was off the topsoil looked looser, as if it had just been disturbed. "Get out of the car, check it," Carlos shouted, his voice deep but tense. The goons jumped out, Diego slinging a pickaxe over his shoulder, Paco muttering curses under his breath, while Miguel flicked a pocket knife in his hand out of habit. Luis, the quiet one, walked over the first hole, knelt down, and started digging with his hands. He dug a few times, then stopped. "Boss," Luis called, his tone steady but laced with a hint of panic. "There's nothing here." Carlos jumped down from the car, his leather shoes hitting the ground hard. "What did you say?" he roared, rushing over to Luis. He knelt down, digging into the dirt himself, but the more he dug, the darker his expression became. The hole was empty. Not a single bag, no trace of the goods worth tens of thousands of dollars they had hidden. "Damn it!" Diego shouted, throwing the shovel down to the ground. "Where the hell is it? We just buried it a few hours ago." Paco stood frozen, then turned to Miguel. "Are you sure we dug in the right spot? Or were you too drunk to remember?" Miguel shot a glare at Paco, the pocket knife in his hand stopping its spin. "I'm not as stupid as you. This is the spot we dug. I remember it clearly. Someone must have taken it." Carlos got up, brushing dirt off his hands, his eyes blazing with anger. He turned to look at John Carver's wooden house, where the flickering oil lamplight spilled through the slightly open door. "That old man," he growled, his voice dropping to a low, predatory tone. "He's the only one around here. No one else knows about this place." The henchman turned back to look at Carlos. Diego spat on the ground, growling, "I swear I'll snap that old man's neck if he dares to touch our stuff." Paco nodded, clenching his fist tightly. "That old weakling thinks he can mess with us? I'll show him what's what." Miguel stepped closer to Carlos, his voice low but filled with suspicion. "Boss, I've been saying it from the start. That guy is not right. Who would dare to mess with our goods?" Luis, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "If it's him, where's he hiding the stash? He couldn't possibly haul all that away by himself so quickly." Carlos didn't respond right away. He stepped closer to the truck, pulling out a baseball bat from back, while gripping a dagger tightly in his other hand. "You don't need to know where the old man is hiding," he said, his voice icy. "We'll get the answers straight from him. Teach him a lesson, and he'll spill everything. Let's go." He raised his hand to signal, and the thugs immediately moved toward the wooden house, their heavy footsteps crunching on the red dirt path. Inside the house, John Carver sat on an old wooden chair, his gaze fixed outside to the window crack. He had heard the sound of the vehicle from a mile away. The ears of a veteran never lose their sharpness. He saw the headlights sweeping across the field, saw Carlos and his goons panic as they discovered the empty pit. He knew they would blame him, and he wanted them to. Rusty, the old dog, lay at his feet, softly growling as the footsteps of the goons drew closer. "Easy, Rusty," John murmured, his voice hoarse yet calm. "They're walking right into the trap." John stood up and slowly walked over to the wooden shelf in the corner of the room. He opened an old box and pulled out a small map with red markings, the plan he had prepared long ago. He knew the goods were no longer in the hole behind the chicken coop. He had moved them right after they left, hiding them in a place that none of those idiots would be smart enough to find. But he wasn't going to tell them. Not now. He folded the map and tucked it into his jacket pocket, then turned back to sit down in his chair, his hand resting gently on Rusty's head. He didn't need a weapon, not yet. He just needed them to walk in, and they were doing exactly what he had predicted. Carlos kicked the front door open with a bang, sending it crashing against the wall with a deafening thud. He stood there, a baseball bat in hand, his eyes blazing as he stared straight at John. The thugs behind him were ready for trouble. Diego gripped his shovel tightly. Paco clenched his fist, Miguel flicked a switchblade open, and Luis watched with a cold, calculating gaze. "Hey, old man," Carlos growled, his voice dripping with menace. "Who the hell do you think you are, messing with my stuff? Spill it. Where are you hiding the goods? Or do I need to beat you into a pulp?" John lifted his head, his gaze calm yet piercing, like a blade hidden beneath a thin layer of ice. He didn't say a word, just stared directly at Carlos, then gave a slight smile, a small grin, but one powerful enough to send a chill down the spines of all his henchmen. The audience would sense that this was the beginning of a confrontation, where the weak in the eyes of the enemy began to reveal their true strength. The wooden door of John Carver's house burst open, the sound crashing through the quiet of the Texas night. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza, stood in the doorway, gripping a baseball bat tightly, his eyes blazing with anger as he stared straight at John. A group of thugs loomed behind him, ready to pounce. Diego clutched a pickaxe as if he wanted to smash something. Paco had his fists clenched. Miguel twirled a switchblade with a gleeful smirk, and Luis watched with an unchanging, cold gaze. The oil lamp inside cast a glow on John's face, highlighting his silver hair and deep wrinkles, but his deep blue eyes remained sharp and unwavering. He sat calmly in an old wooden chair, his hand resting gently on Rusty, the old dog was softly growling at his feet. "Speak up, old man," Carlos shouted, stepping further into the house, his baseball bat raised high, ready to swing down at any moment. "Where you hiding my stuff? I'm giving you 3 seconds to spill, or I'll turn you into mush right here." The thug snickered, Paco's raspy laughter echoing in the room. "If you don't talk, I'll personally rip your tongue out," Diego yelled, swinging a pickaxe menacingly. Miguel moved in closer, his switchblade glinting under the light. "I like this kind of vibe. It's been a while since I got to cut something for fun." Only Louis stood still, his eyes scanning the room, as if searching for a clue. John didn't respond right away. He lifted his head, looking straight at Carlos, his gaze calm yet holding a strength that no one in the room could comprehend. He gave a slight smile, a small, cold smile, but now it was clearer, enough to make Carlos pause for a moment. "Who do you think I am?" John finally spoke, his voice hoarse yet deliberate, each word forged like steel. "You think I'm just sitting here waiting for you to come and take a swing at me?" He didn't stand up, didn't move, but the way he spoke made the air in the room feel heavier. Carlos frowned, lowering the baseball bat slightly. "What the hell are you talking about? Old man, who do you think you are, talking back here?" He took another step forward, his leather shoes thudding hard against the wooden floor. "I don't care who you are. Where's my stuff? Speak up, or I swear you won't have a home to sit in anymore." Diego rushed in, standing next to Carlos, the shovel raised high. "Did you hear my boss? Spill it, or I'll smash your head in first." John remained motionless. He looked at Carlos, then glanced over the group of henchmen, as if assessing each one of them. "You guys dug that hole, hid the goods, and then left," he said, his tone flat, but loaded with meaning. "You think I don't know? You think I can't see?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Rusty growled louder, rising from the floor, his ears perked up, his gaze fixed on Carlos. John gestured for him to sit down, then continued, "Your stuff isn't there anymore, but if you want to look for it, go ahead." John's words were like pouring gasoline on a fire. Carlos roared, charging forward, swinging the baseball bat fiercely at John. But just before the bat could hit him, John leaned to the side, so quick that none of the goons had time to react. The bat slammed down onto the wooden floor, leaving a long crack, the loud thud startling everyone. John remained seated, not moving from his chair, his gaze fixed on Carlos, as if he were looking at a child who had just done something foolish. "You guys are too slow," he said, his voice deepening. "You really think that bat could do anything to me?" Carlos was panting, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He turned around, signaling to his henchmen, "Get in there, beat the old man for me. I want to hear him beg." Diego charged in first, swinging a pickaxe at John, but John leaned aside, this time quicker, causing Diego to lose his balance and crash into the wall. A loud thud echoed as the pickaxe embedded itself in the wooden floor, and Diego cursed loudly. "Damn it, the old man is too quick." Paco rushed in next, fists raised high, but John simply pushed his chair back slightly, causing Paco to miss and faceplant onto the floor. Miguel, seeing the scene, jumped forward with a switchblade, the steel glinting as he lunged at John. But John stood up, his left hand grabbing Miguel's wrist and twisting it hard. There was a sharp crack. The knife clattered to the floor, and Miguel screamed in pain, clutching his arm as he stumbled back. "What the hell? What kind of monster are you?" he yelled, his face pale. Luis, the quiet one, finally stirred, stepping forward with a more cautious gaze. He didn't rush in. He just stood there, watching John as if he were facing something far beyond his expectations. Carlos stood frozen, watching his henchmen get taken down in just a few seconds without anyone even touching John. He tightened his grip on the club and shouted, "What are you doing? Take him down." But John, now standing tall, took a step toward Carlos. He wasn't tall or muscular, but the way he moved slowly and deliberately made the whole room feel smaller. "You want to teach me a lesson?" he said, his voice dropping, cold as a Texas night wind. "Then go ahead and try. But I warn you, you're not going to like the lesson I'm about to teach you." Rusty growled louder, standing in front of John, its gaze fixed on Carlos. The henchman stepped back, no longer as confident as when it entered. Diego clutched his aching shoulder. Paco struggled to get back on his feet. Miguel trembled with his arm wrapped around himself, and Luis stood still, his eyes now filled with doubt instead of the coldness they once held. Carlos breathed heavily, the stick in his hand shaking. He couldn't understand what was happening. The frail old man he looked down on now stood before him like a ghost, unafraid and unwavering. John didn't attack. He just stood there, his sharp gaze sweeping over each one of them. He knew they were panicking, knew they were wondering who he was, and he wanted them to question what his next move would be. "You guys want the goods?" he said, his voice low but clear. "Go ahead and look. But I'll warn you, you're not going to like the price." He walked over to the chair, sat down as if nothing had happened, and ran his hand over Rusty's head. The audience could feel that this was the moment John's true power began to reveal itself, and the tension in the room had reached its peak. The atmosphere in John Carver's wooden house was now as heavy as the Texas sky before a storm. Carlos El Toro Mendoza stood frozen in the middle of the room, the baseball bat in his hand trembling, his face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. His henchmen Diego, Paco, Miguel, and Luis stepped back a few paces, their eyes filled with doubt and fear as they looked at John. The old man they had once mocked and scorned had just taken down three of their own with a few swift moves, without needing a weapon, without even getting up from his chair for too long. John now sat back in the old wooden chair, stroking Rusty, the old dog that was quietly growling, his gaze calm yet as sharp as a blade hidden beneath a layer of ice. Carlos breathed heavily, trying to regain his composure. He couldn't believe that this frail old man with gray hair, looking like he was on the brink of death, could send his goons into a panic in just a few seconds. He tightened his grip on the club and shouted, "Who do you think you are, old man? You think we're scared of you? I'll smash you to pieces right now." He lunged forward again, swinging the club fiercely at John's head. But this time, John didn't just sit there. John sprang up, quick as a shadow, his right hand snatching the club out of the air and twisting it hard. The sound of its snapping echoed, the club broke in two, and Carlos lost his balance, tumbling forward. He slammed his face onto the floor, blood streaming from his nose, a string of curses escaping his lips along with his ragged breaths. The henchman stood frozen in shock. Diego, still clutching his aching shoulder from the earlier fall, shouted, "What the hell? What kind of monster are you? How are you so fast?" Paco struggled to get back on his feet from the fall, his face pale. "I swear I've never seen anyone like him. He's not human." Miguel, his hand still trembling after John had twisted his wrist, backed away toward the door, his switchblade lost somewhere. "I told you, we shouldn't have messed with him." Only Luis remained still, his gaze no longer cold but filled with caution, as if he were facing an enemy he couldn't comprehend. John took a step toward Carlos, his old shoes creaking on the wooden floor. He bent down, picked up the other half of the stick, and tossed it aside like it was a useless piece of junk. "You think you're going to teach me a lesson?" he said, his voice hoarse yet ringing clearly in the room. "You're not even close." He turned to face the goons, his gaze sweeping over each one, making them instinctively take a step back. "You think I'm some frail old man just sitting here waiting to die? You got it all wrong. I'm not someone you can mess with without facing the consequences." Carlos struggled to get up, blood streaming from his nose down to his chin, his eyes bloodshot with pain and humiliation. He pulled a dagger from his belt, his hand trembling as he pointed it at John. You're dead for sure, old man. I'll slit your throat right here." He lunged forward, the knife aimed straight at John's chest, but John simply leaned to the side, his left hand grabbing Carlos's wrist and twisting it hard. There was a sharp crack. The knife clattered to the floor, and Carlos screamed, dropping to his knees, cradling his arm. "Damn it! Who the hell are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking from the pain. John didn't answer right away. He walked past Carlos, moving closer to the group of thugs huddled near the door. Diego raised a pickaxe as if to defend himself, but his hand shook so badly he could barely hold it. "Stay back, old man," he shouted, his voice cracking. John stopped, looked Diego straight in the eye, and then gently shook his head. "You don't need that pickaxe," he said. his voice dropping. "You want the goods? I already told you to look for them. But I'll warn you one last time. You're not going to like the price you'll have to pay." Luis, the quiet one, finally spoke up, his voice steady but with a hint of tension. "He's not just any farmer. He used to be something we don't know." He stepped closer to Carlos, helping him to his feet, his gaze never leaving John. "Boss, we should pull back. He's not someone we can handle." Carlos shoved Luis away, growling, "Pull back? I'm not going anywhere. Where's my stuff? I'm going to get answers from him right now." He struggled to stand, but his right arm was broken, leaving only his trembling left hand to reach the knife on the floor. John turned back, looking at Carlos with a gaze that was almost pitying. "You're really stubborn," he said, his voice flat. "But being stubborn won't save you." He stepped over to the wooden shelf in the corner of the room and opened an old box. He pulled out a small map marked with red ink, holding it up for Carlos to see, but not letting him get a clear look. "You guys think I've hidden the goods somewhere out there? You're wrong. Your stuff is still here, right on this farm. But you'll never find it not with those thick heads of yours." Carlos roared, trying to charge forward again, but Luis held him back. "Boss, that's enough. He's just playing with us. We don't know who he is. We don't know what he's got. Let's go, before things get worse." Diego nodded frantically, his voice filled with panic. "I agree with Luis. I don't want to die in this godforsaken place." Paco and Miguel also backed away toward the door, their eyes wide with fear. But Carlos, despite the pain and humiliation, shouted, "You're all cowards. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to kill him." John stepped closer to Carlos, leaning down to look him straight in the eyes. "You want to kill me?" he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Go ahead, but I'll tell you, this you won't live to tell the tale." He straightened up, turned, and sat back down in his chair, running his hand over Rusty's head as if nothing had happened. But his gaze was sharp and unforgiving, locked on Carlos like a final warning. The henchman stood frozen, no one daring to move. Carlos knelt there, blood streaming from his nose, clutching his broken wrist, his face twisted in pain and fear. He knew he had lost not because of strength, but because of John's terrifying calmness. The audience would feel this was a climax of the confrontation, where John Carver was not just a frail old man, but ghost in the past, ready to crush anyone who dared to step into his territory. After the tense confrontation in the wooden house, Carlos El Toro Mendoza knelt on the floor, blood streaming from his nose, his right hand bent at an unnatural angle, his eyes filled with both pain and confusion. Diego, Paco, Miguel, and Luis huddled near the door, none daring to step closer to John Carver anymore. The old man they had once looked down on now sat calmly in an old wooden chair, stroking Rusty's head, his cold gaze sweeping over each of them like a silent warning. But Carlos, humiliated and defeated in that house, refused to give up. He struggled to get back on his feet, his left hand trembling as he picked up the dagger from the floor, roaring, "What are you all standing there for? My stuff is still here. Search it. Turn this farm upside down for me." The henchman hesitated. Diego, still wincing from the pain of his earlier fall, muttered, "Boss, this old man isn't normal. We should pull out." Paco nodded, his face pale. "I don't want to die here." But Carlos turned around, his eyes blazing. "You guys are a bunch of cowards. There's no product. What do you think I'm paying you for? Get out there, find it now." Luis, the quiet one, shot a glance at John one more time, then stepped out of the house without saying a word. Miguel followed, cradling his broken wrist and muttering curses under his breath. Diego and Paco reluctantly trailed behind, the headlights from the truck outside casting their shadows across the field. John sat still, not trying to stop them. He knew what they were going to do. They were going to search the farm, and he wanted them to. He had been preparing for this for a long time, ever since the first day he set foot on this land. He stood up, walked over to the wooden shelf, and took the small map with the red markings that he had held up in front of Carlos. He unfolded it, his weathered fingers gliding over the marked points. The chicken coop, the fence, the barn, the fields. Each point was a trap, a part of the fortress he had built to protect this place. "You want to play?" he muttered, his voice rough. Then let's play. He folded the map back up, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and returned to his seat, his gaze fixed outside through the window's crack. Outside, the henchmen were splitting up the search. Diego and Paco headed toward the chicken coop, where they had once hidden their stash. If it's not here, where the hell could he have hidden it? Diego cursed, raising his shovel to dig up the old hole again. Paco stood beside him, glancing around anxiously. I swear I heard something. Did you hear it? Diego paused digging, frowning. Hear what? Are you imagining things? But just then a small crack echoed beneath Paco's feet. He jumped, bent down, and before he could grasp what was happening, the ground gave way. A hidden tunnel, camouflaged by a thin layer of dirt, opened up, and Paco tumbled down, screaming, "Damn it! Help me!" Diego rushed over, kneeling beside the pit, the truck's headlights shining just enough to reveal Paco lying underneath, clutching his painfully injured leg. "What the hell is this? Where did this pit come from?" Diego shouted, trying to pull Paco up, but the ground around them began to crumble, forcing him to back away. From inside the house, John smirked slightly. The pit wasn't deep, just enough to trap an unlucky soul, but it was a first step in his plan. He had dug such pits all over the farm, camouflaged with dirt and dry grass, waiting for the day that would serve their purpose. Meanwhile, Luis and Miguel walked toward the shed at the corner of the farm. Miguel, still nursing his sore hand, muttered, "I swear that old man is up to something. Who could pull off stuff like this?" Luis didn't respond. He just pushed the shed door open. Inside it was pitch dark, and the smell of rotting wood and machine oil hung in the air. He stepped inside, turned on the flashlight on his phone, and scanned the area. But as soon as his foot hit the floor, a small click echoed. Miguel jumped. What was that? Before Luis could answer, a tripwire hidden under the floor was triggered, and from the corner of the shed, a thick cloud of smoke erupted, engulfing both of them. Luis coughed and waved his hands, trying to clear the smoke. What the hell is this? Miguel shouted as he rushed outside, but the thick smoke stung his eyes, causing him to trip over an old wooden crate. There was a loud crash as the crate shattered, and Miguel fell flat on his face, cursing loudly. Inside the house, John heard the shouts, the coughing, and the thud. He didn't laugh, but a glimmer of satisfaction lit up his eyes. That smoke trap was an old idea of his from his days in special forces, simple yet effective, just enough to disorient the enemy. Carlos, still standing near the truck, heard Paco scream and Luis's cough. He turned around, clutching his broken wrist, and growled, "What the hell are you guys doing? Find the goods. Don't just stand there yelling." But as he stepped closer to the chicken coop to check, a strange sound echoed from the field, a crackling noise like a radio going haywire, followed by a deep voice saying, "Alpha team, move up, surround the target." Carlos froze, his face going pale. What the hell is that? The military? He turned his head to look around, but he saw no one except for his panicked goons. John chuckled softly for the first time that night from inside the house. The old speakers he had hidden around the farm, connected to a cheap tape recorder, had just been activated. He knew it wouldn't fool them forever, but it was enough to scare them, enough to throw them into chaos. The Texas night grew deeper, the biting cold sweeping across the fields, carrying with the sound of the wind howling through the cracks of John Carver's farm. Carlos El Toro Mendoza stood near the truck, cradling his broken wrist, his face pale after hearing the military-like sounds from the speakers that John had activated at the end of Part 1. He turned his head, his bewildered gaze scanning the darkness, desperately searching for any sign of the figures he believed to be the Alpha team. But aside from Paco's screams from the underground near the chicken coop and the coughing of Luis and Miguel from the barn, there was nothing but the eerie silence of the farm. "Where the hell are you guys?" Carlos shouted, his voice cracking with panic mixed with anger. He stepped closer to the chicken coop, where Diego was struggling to pull Paco up from a pit. "Help me, damn it!" Paco yelled, his leg trapped under a rotting plank in the pit, blood oozing from a gash on his knee. Diego knelt beside him, hands trembling as he dug at the dirt. But every time he tried, the ground crumbled more, making Paco curse loudly. "What the hell are you doing, Diego? Pull me up, or I swear I'll smash you." Diego turned around, yelling back, "You think I want this? I don't even know where this pit came from." Carlos stepped closer, the headlights in the truck illuminating his face, highlighting the dried blood on his nose and his wild eyes. "Do you guys hear that noise?" he shouted, his left hand pointing toward the field. "The army? Where are they? Who did this?" Diego stopped dragging Paco, looking up with a pale face. "The army? Are you serious, boss? We're dead for sure." Paco, from the basement, yelled, "I don't care about the army or anything. Just pull me up first, you idiot." But before Diego could respond, another crack echoed from the nearby fence, and Carlos turned around, his heart pounding. From inside the house, John Carver sat on a wooden chair, gently stroking Rusty's head, his gaze fixed outside through the window. He heard Paco's screams, Diego's curses, and the panic in Carlos's voice. He knew they were falling into the trap step by step, just as he had predicted. The underground pit that Paco had fallen into was just the beginning, and the fake military loudspeaker was the first psychological blow. He had set up a few more traps around the fence, thin wires connected to simple yet effective devices. He murmured softly, "You haven't seen anything yet." Rusty growled quietly, as if in agreement. In the warehouse, Luis and Miguel were still struggling through the thick smoke. Luis was coughing violently, waving his hands to push the smoke away. But his eyes were stinging, and he could see nothing but darkness and the faint light from a flashlight lying somewhere on the floor. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice losing its calm for the first time that night. Miguel, face down after tripping over a wooden crate, scrambled to get up, clutching his broken wrist. "I can't breathe. What the hell is that old man doing?" He tried to run toward the door, but the dense smoke caused him to crash into the wall, a loud thud echoing as his head hit the wood. Luis finally found a way out, pulling Miguel along. The two of them stumbled outside, taking the fresh air, but their faces were pale, and their eyes were bloodshot from the smoke. "I swear I heard the sound of soldiers," Miguel mumbled, his voice trembling. Does he have a whole army here?" Luis shook his head, trying to stay calm. "There's no army. It's just a speaker, I'm sure of it. But that guy, he's not normal." He turned his head back towards the wooden house, his gaze filled with doubt and fear. Carlos, from the chicken coop, heard Luis and Miguel stumbling around in the shed. He shouted, "What the hell are you guys doing in there? Find the stuff. Don't just stand around coughing." But just then, a small whoosh sounded from the fence, and another cloud of smoke burst out, this time right near where Carlos was standing. He jumped back, flailing his arms in the haze. "Damn it, not again." He coughed violently, his eyes stinging, and in his panic, he tripped over another tripwire. A sharp snap echoed, and from the field, the loudspeakers blared. "Bravo team, lock on target. Prepare to fire." Carlos collapsed on the ground, cradling his broken wrist, his face stripped of any trace of the arrogance of a gang boss. "The army! They're really here!" he screamed, his voice breaking. Diego, from the chicken coop, turned to look at Carlos, panic etched on his face. "Boss, we're done for. We need to get out or we're dead for sure." Paco, still stuck in the basement, shouted, "Don't leave me, you bastards." Luis and Miguel rushed over to Carlos, both panting heavily. "Boss, there's no army," Luis said, his voice urgent. "But that old man, he's playing us. We have to go." John, from inside the house, heard everything. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. He saw Carlos sitting on the ground in the smoke, saw Diego and Paco panicking near the chicken coop, saw Luis and Miguel stumbling in the darkness. He knew they were collapsing not because of the power of weapons, but because of the fear he had instilled in their minds. He had turned the farm into a maze of traps and psychological warfare, and they were killing their own will to fight. The audience would feel that this was the moment John Carver had complete control of the situation, and Carlos's henchmen were nothing more than puppets in his hands. The Texas night has turned into a chaotic battlefield, but not the kind filled with gunfire. It's a maze of fear and surprises. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza sits on the ground near the truck, clutching his broken wrist, smoke from the triggered trap still swirling around him, making him cough violently. The military-style loudspeaker blares, "Bravo team, lock on target. Prepare to fire, echoing across the fields, repeating like an unending threat. Near the chicken coop, Paco is still stuck in the underground tunnel, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Pull me up, you bastards!" Diego, standing above, trembles, unsure what to do as the ground crumbles more each time he tries to pull. Over by the warehouse, Luis and Miguel stumble through the darkness, their faces smeared with soot, eyes filled with confusion. Carlos gasped for breath, tried to get back on his feet, but his legs were like jelly after the fall in the smoke. He turned to look at his henchman, roaring, "What the hell are you doing? Find the goods. Don't just stand there shaking." But his voice no longer held the authority it once did. It wavered, weak, like someone desperately trying to hide their fear. Louis stepped closer, his gaze now tense instead of cold. "Boss, there's no army," he said, his voice urgent. "But that old man, he's pulling all the strings. We need to pull out or we're dead for sure." Miguel nodded vigorously, clutching his broken wrist. "I agree. I don't want to be here another second." Diego, from the chicken coop, turned around and shouted, "How can we pull out when Paco is still stuck down there? Are you guys planning to leave him?" Paco, hearing this, yelled from the basement, "Don't leave me, you bastards! I'll kill you if you dare to go." Carlos staggered his feet, his left hand gripping the dagger tightly, his eyes wild. "No one's pulling out. My stuff is here, and I'm going to find it, even if I have to turn this whole farm upside down." He pointed toward the wooden house, where the oil lamp flickered dimly through the window. "That old man, he knows everything. I'm going to get the answers out of him." Inside the house, John Carver stood by the window, his gaze fixed outside, watching every move of the henchman. He heard Paco's screams, the arguments between Diego and Luis, and the madness in Carlos's voice. He knew they were falling apart not because of physical strength, but because of the fear he had instilled in their minds. The underground bunker, the thick smoke, and the fake military loudspeakers were just the beginning. He had set up dozens of traps all over the farm, from simple tripwires to more complex ones he had learned during his years in special forces. He softly murmured to Rusty, the old dog standing beside him, "They haven't seen anything yet, have they?" Rusty growled softly, as if in agreement. Carlos, despite the pain and panic, refused to give up. He turned back to his henchmen, shouting, "Keep going! Search the fields, the barn, everywhere. I don't believe he could have done it all." He stepped closer to the fence, the headlights in the truck casting his shadow. But as he set foot on a patch of ground nearby, a small click echoed. Before he could react, another trap was triggered, and from beneath the ground, an old net hidden under the dry grass sprang up, wrapping around his legs. Carlos fell hard, the net tightening around him, making him scream, "Damn it! What the hell is this?" He thrashed about, his dagger slipping from his hand, but the more he struggled, the tighter the net became. Diego turned back to look at Carlos, his face pale. "Boss! What's going on?" He ran over, but as he stepped onto another patch of ground, a loud thud echoed and smoke erupted again, this time right in Diego's face. He coughed violently, stumbling back and crashing into the fence. "I can't see anything. He's trying to kill us." Paco, from the basement, heard the screams and shouted, "Help me! What are you guys doing?" Luis and Miguel, from the direction of the warehouse, rushed closer to Carlos, but both stopped when the loudspeaker blared again. "Charlie team, move up, fire when ready." The booming voice drowned out Carlos and Diego's cries. John stepped out of the house and walked over to the wooden shelf, opening an old box. He pulled out a stopwatch that had long since stopped ticking, a keepsake from his days in the military. He turned it over in his hands, his eyes lighting up. He didn't need to go outside, didn't need to confront anyone directly. This farm was his weapon, and every trap was a blow he had meticulously planned. He knew Carlos wouldn't back down. The guy was too stubborn, too foolish to realize he had already lost. And he wanted him to keep going, wanted him to drag his whole gang deeper into this maze. Carlos, lying under the net, shouted, "Let me go! You guys do something." Luis rushed in, trying to cut the net with his bare hands, but the net was made of old nylon, tough and sturdy. Miguel stood nearby, his voice trembling. "Boss, we can't do this. He has a whole system set up here." Diego, still coughing from the smoke, staggered to his feet and yelled, "I told you, get out or we're all dead." But Carlos, even trapped in the net, continued to scream, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to kill him." John heard that scream, and he let out a cold, meaningful smile. He set down his watch and walked over to the window. He saw Carlos thrashing in the net, Diego coughing the smoke, Paco trapped in the basement, and Luis and Miguel standing frozen. He knew they had reached the limit. Fear had consumed their will. The Texas field now resembled a vivid nightmare beneath the pitch-black sky. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza was trapped in a nylon net near the fence, his leg ensnared, his left hand thrashing hopelessly, his face twisted in pain and fear. The thick smoke from a recently triggered trap lingered around him, making him cough violently, his eyes bloodshot. Near the chicken coop, Paco was still stuck in the underground bunker, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Where are you guys? Pull me up." Diego, standing nearby, staggered through another cloud of smoke, clutching his face and cursing loudly. By the barn, Luis and Miguel stood frozen, their eyes wide with confusion as they looked at Carlos, too scared to move forward due to the booming voice of the fake military loudspeaker echoing, "Charlie team, advance! Fire when ready." Carlos, despite being stuck tight, shouted, "You guys let me go! Don't just stand there like a bunch of idiots." He tried to pull at the net with his left hand, but the nylon only tightened more, cutting into his skin. Luis rushed over, kneeling beside Carlos, his hands trembling as he tried to untangle him. "Boss, stay calm. I'm working on it," he said, his voice frantic, but the net was too tough, and in the dark, he couldn't see the knots clearly. Miguel stood nearby, cradling his broken wrist, mumbling, "I told you, that old man is a monster. We're definitely gonna die." Carlos turned around, his eyes wild. "Shut up, Miguel. I'm not dying here." In the wooden house, John Carver stood by the window, his sharp gaze observing the chaos outside. He heard Carlos's screams, Diego's curses, and Paco's desperate cries for help. He knew they had reached their breaking point. There it shattered, leaving only fear and helplessness. He stepped over to the wooden shelf and took an old stopwatch from the keepsake box from his days in the Special Forces. He turned it over in his hands, the oil lamp casting a glow on his weathered face. "You think this is all I've got?" he muttered, his voice hoarse yet filled with confidence. Rusty, the old dog, stood beside him, growling softly, as if sensing the impending climax. John set the clock down and walked over to a corner of the room where he had hidden a small control panel for a makeshift device, simple yet effective, connected to the speaker system and a few other traps around the farm. He pressed a button, and from a direction of the field, the speaker blared again, this time louder and more urgent. "Delta team, surround the target. Prepare to detonate." The crackling sound of the fake radio echoed, drowning out Carlos's screams. He knew this sound wouldn't fool them forever, but it was enough to push them into the depths of panic, and that's exactly what he wanted. Outside, Carlos heard the new speaker blaring, and his face went pale. Detonate? What are they planning? He struggled harder, but the net only tightened, making him scream in pain. Luis, still trying to free the net, turned to look at Miguel. "Go find something to cut this. Hurry." Miguel stumbled toward the truck, but as he stepped over a nearby patch of ground, a whoosh sounded, and thick smoke erupted again, this time denser. He fell to the ground, coughing violently, shouting, "Damn it! I can't take this anymore. We're done for." The smoke spread out, engulfing both Luis and Carlos, causing the cough uncontrollably, their eyes stinging and unable to see anything. Near the chicken coop, Diego heard Miguel's screams and sound the detonation speaker. He turned to Paco, his voice trembling. "I can't save you. We have to run." Paco, from the basement, shouted back, "Don't leave me, you bastard. I'll kill you." But Diego didn't listen anymore. He turned and ran toward the truck, but in his panic, he tripped over another tripwire. A loud snap echoed, and a small board rigged with a homemade spring shot up from the ground, slamming right into his leg. Diego fell flat on his face, clutching his leg and groaning, "Damn it! What now?" Carlos, trapped in the net, heard Diego and Miguel's screams. Feeling everything crumbling around him, he turned to Luis, his voice trembling. "That old man, he has a whole crew here, doesn't he? We're dead for sure." Luis, coughing through the smoke, shook his head. "There's no crew, boss. It's just him, all alone. But we can't win this." He tried to free himself from the net once more, but his hands were shaking too violently to do anything. The loudspeaker blared again. "Prepare for detonation. 5, 4, 3. Carlos shouted, drowning out the speaker. "Stop. I surrender. Take the goods. I don't need them anymore." John, from inside the house, heard Carlos's scream. He smirked slightly, not a joyful smile, but the grin of someone who knows he has won. He stepped toward the door, his hand brushing the doorknob, but he didn't open it. He didn't need to go outside, not yet. They had defeated themselves, falling right into the trap he had set. He knew Carlos wasn't truly giving up. The guy was too stubborn to completely throw in the towel, but that scream was the clearest sign. His spirit had shattered. Outside, the smoke thickened and the countdown echoed. 2-1, Diego curled up, hugging his knees near the chicken coop. Paco was trapped in the basement. Miguel coughed in the smoke near the truck. Luis knelt beside Carlos, and Carlos thrashed in the net, screaming in despair. No explosion came, just a voice repeating, "Target locked." But for the henchmen, that was more than enough. They had lost their will, their strength. As Carlos struggled in the net, surrounded by thick smoke, the countdown echoed. 3, 2, 1. John Carver had turned the farm into a perfect trap without a gun, relying solely on his sharp mind and unyielding will. Can you feel the power of that resilience? If your heart is racing from this moment, hit like to honor this unsung hero, and subscribe to the channel to experience more heart-stopping stories like this. Thank you. John Carver's farm was now engulfed in complete chaos, but it was a kind of chaos he had anticipated and fully controlled. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza was trapped in a nylon net near the fence, the smoke from the trap still swirling around him, his face smeared with blood and dirt, and his once mad eyes now filled with sheer helplessness. The military-style loudspeaker counted down, 2, 1, and then repeated, "Target locked," echoing across the fields like a final psychological blow shattering the will of the henchman. Near the chicken coop, Diego clutched his leg, groaning after being struck by a flying board, while Paco remained stuck in the bunker, his voice hoarse from screaming. By the truck, Miguel was coughing and choking in the smoke, while Luis knelt beside Carlos, his hands trembling, unsure what to do. Carlos, despite being stuck, screamed out in despair, "I give up. Take the goods. I don't need them anymore." But his voice was weak, fading away, lacking any of the authority of a gang boss who had confidently walked into this farm. Luis looked up, staring at Carlos with a mix of anger and disappointment. "Boss, we've lost," he said, his tone low but firm. "That old man, he's won. We can't do anything." He stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes, and turned to the henchmen. "Diego, Miguel, pull Paco up. We need to retreat." Diego, clutching his aching leg, staggered to his feet, cursing, "You're pulling out? I wanted to leave a long time ago, damn it." He turned back to the chicken coop, knelt by the pit, and tried to pull Paco up once more. "You're heavy as hell, Paco. Come on, give it a little push." From the pit, Paco groaned, "I can't feel my legs anymore. Pull me up, you bastard." Miguel rushed over to help. Even though his own hand was still throbbing from John's earlier blow inside the house, together, they strained and finally managed to haul Paco up, but the hefty guy collapsed face first on the ground, gasping for breath, too exhausted to curse anymore. In the wooden house, John Carver stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the scene outside. He heard Carlos's cries of surrender, the arguing of the thugs, and Paco's groans as he was dragged up. The climax had passed. He knew that. He had pushed them to their limits, causing them to collapse on their own, without needing to lift a finger. He stepped over to the small control panel in the corner of the room and pressed a button to turn off the speaker system. The voice announcing, "Target locked," fell silent, and the space returned to stillness, with only the sound of the wind howling across the fields and the heavy breathing of the thugs remaining. John sat down on the old wooden chair, his hand stroking Rusty's head. Got the head part done, huh? He murmured, his voice hoarse yet laced with a cold humor. He didn't need to go outside, didn't need to face it head-on anymore. His trap hidden underground, shrouded in smoke, nylon nets, and fake speakers had done all the work. They weren't just physical tools. They were a psychological weapon he'd learned during his years in Special Forces, making the enemy fear themselves more than they feared him. He glanced through the window crack and saw Carlos still tangled in the net, but the henchmen had started to regroup, staggering toward the truck. Outside, Luis helped Carlos to his feet after cutting through the net with a small knife Miguel had found in the truck. Carlos, with a broken right arm and trembling legs, no longer had the strength to scream. He looked at Luis, his voice weak. Who are you? How could you do all this? Luis shook his head, his gaze empty. I don't know, boss, but he's not an ordinary guy. We messed with the wrong person. He pulled Carlos toward the truck and called back. Diego, Miguel, get Paco in the truck. We need to leave right now. Diego and Miguel helped Paco, the heavy-set guy limping along with his injured leg, groaning, I swear I'm never coming back to this godforsaken place again. Diego nodded, his face smeared with smoke and dirt. Me too. That old man, he's a nightmare. Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, muttered, I told you from the start, we shouldn't have messed with him. The whole group stumbled into the truck, with Luis sliding into the driver's seat, starting the engine. The roar of the motor shattered the stillness of night, and the headlights swept across the field one last time before the truck backed up and barreled down the dirt road. John stood up, walked to the door, and opened it for the first time that night. He stood on the porch, the cold wind blowing through his silver hair, his gaze following the truck as it faded into the distance. He didn't chase after it. There was no need. They had lost, not because he had defeated them with strength, but because he had made them defeat themselves. He knew their goods were still here, hidden in a secret cellar beneath the warehouse that they would never find. But he didn't care about the goods. He just wanted them to be gone from his land. Rusty stepped up to stand beside John, his tail gently thumping against the wooden floor. He bent down and stroked its head. They're gone, Rusty, he said, his voice dropping. But I bet they'll be back. And when they do, we'll be ready. He turned back into the house, closing the door behind him, the flickering oil lamp casting a shadow of a frail old man, yet holding the strength of a warrior who had never stopped fighting. Carlos El Toro, Mendoza's truck roared away from John Carver's farm, leaving a trail of red dust on the Texas dirt road. The night was deep and the cold air swept across the fields, but inside Carlos, a fire of anger still smoldered. Even though his resolve had crumbled after the series of traps in the underground, the choking smoke, the nylon nets, and the sound of military-style speakers. His henchmen Diego, Paco, Miguel, and Luis huddled in the truck, some clutching their legs, others holding their arms, none daring to meet Carlos's gaze. He sat in the passenger seat, his right arm broken and his face smeared with blood, staring through the windshield with fiery eyes, his breath heavy like a wounded beast. You guys think I'm giving up? Carlos shouted, his voice hoarse from smoke and pain. You think I'm just going to let that old man win? Luis, the driver, shot a glance at Carlos, his tone low but tense. Boss, we've lost. He's got the whole place rigged with traps, speakers, everything. We don't even know who he is. Diego, sitting in the back, hugged his leg and groaned. I agree with Luis. That guy is a nightmare. I'm not going back. Paco, the chubby guy who had just been pulled up from the basement, mumbled, Me neither. My leg feels like it's dying here. Miguel, clutching his broken wrist, just nodded, saying nothing. But Carlos didn't listen. He tightened his left fist and slammed it against the dashboard, startling everyone in the car. You guys are cowards. My stuff is out there. My money is out there. That old man isn't some kind of god. He's just a bastard who knows how to play tricks. I'm coming back, and this time I'll kill him. He turned to Luis, his eyes wild. Turn the car around. Right now. Luis hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Boss, we don't have the strength left. He'll kill us all. Carlos pulled a dagger from his belt with his left hand and pressed it close to Luis's throat. I said turn around. Do it, or you'll be the first to die. Louis swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with fear, but he gripped the wheel and turned the car around. The henchmen in the back were cursing loudly. "Damn it, I don't want to die." Diego shouted. Paco groaned. The boss has lost it. But no one dared to jump out of the car. Carlos was still the leader, and his madness was enough to keep them scared. The truck barreled back down the dirt road, the headlights sweeping across the fields, heading straight for John Carver's farm once more. In the wooden house, John stood on the porch, the cold wind blowing through his silver hair. He had just closed the door after watching the truck drive away, but his keen ears, honed from years in special forces, caught the sound of an engine returning from a distance. He smirked slightly, a cold smile appearing on his weathered face. "I knew it," he muttered to Rusty, the old dog standing beside him. "That guy's tougher than I thought." He stepped inside the house, opened the old wooden box on the shelf, and pulled out a small map marked with red ink the plan he had prepared in advance. He knew Carlos wouldn't give up easily, and he was ready for that. The truck came to a stop in front of the farm gate, the headlights illuminating the wooden house. Carlos jumped down, his left hand gripping a dagger, his right arm hanging limply by his side. He turned to the group of henchmen and growled, "Get out. You guys go look for the goods, and I'll take care of that old man." The henchmen hesitated, but under Carlos's wild gaze, they reluctantly climbed out. Diego and Paco trudged toward the chicken coop, while Miguel and Luis headed for the barn, but none of them felt the slightest bit of confidence like they had the first time they came here. Carlos didn't wait. He charged straight toward the wooden house, kicking the door hard once more. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. But inside, John was no longer sitting there. The room was empty, lit only by a flickering oil lamp, and the sound of the wind howled through the cracks. Carlos roared, "Where you, old man? Get out here right now, or I'll slit your throat." He stepped inside, knife raised high, his eyes scanning the room. But John wasn't there. He had left the house as soon as he heard the car turn back, slipping out to the shed through a secret passage he had dug long ago. Carlos, unable to find John, stormed outside, his eyes wild with fury. He shouted, "You guys, find that old man. He's hiding somewhere around here." He rushed toward the shed, where Luis and Miguel were searching. As Carlos flung the shed door open, he saw the two henchmen frozen in place, Miguel's flashlight beam illuminating a corner of the wall. Carlos stepped forward, growling, "What the hell are you doing just standing there?" But then he froze, his gaze locked onto what Miguel was shining the light on a worn tactical map hanging on the wall, with red markings all over the farm. The chicken coop, the fence, the fields, the shed. Carlos frowned and stepped closer. He yanked the map down, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. The symbols, lines, and handwritten notes indicated that this was no ordinary map. It looked like something the military would use. He turned to Luis, his voice shaky. "What is this? Is he military?" Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, muttered, "I told you, he's not an ordinary guy." Luis bent down and picked up a small object that had fallen from the map, a worn, rusty military badge, engraved with an eagle and the faded words, "Special Forces." He held it up for Carlos, his eyes wide with confusion. "Boss, he used to be a Special Forces soldier. We've messed with the wrong person." Carlos stood frozen, gripping the badge tightly, his expression shifting from anger to fear. He never expected the frail, scrawny old man he had looked down upon to have such a past. But then, from behind the shed, a small crack echoed like footsteps on rotting wood. Carlos turned around, shouting, "He's over there. Go after him." He burst out the back door of the shed, launching into a chase that he believed would end with John's death. The barn at John Carver's farm had now become the epicenter of a brewing storm of tension. Carlos El Toro Mendoza burst out the back door, his left hand gripping a dagger tightly, his wild eyes scanning the darkness after hearing a crack from the rotting wood. He had just uncovered the tactical map and an old military badge signs that made him realize John wasn't the frail old man he had once scorned. Luis and Miguel stumbled behind him, their faces smeared with smoke from the traps, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Near the chicken coop, Diego and Paco continued to search, but their shouts had faded their spirits shattered after the chaotic events that had unfolded earlier. Carlos no longer cared about the henchmen. He had only one goal: to find and kill John Carver. "Where the hell are you hiding, old man?" he roared, his voice hoarse from smoke and the pain of his broken arm. He charged across the field behind the barn, the headlights in the truck illuminating only part of the area, leaving thick shadows that seemed to swallow everything. He tripped over an old log, falling hard, but quickly got back up, his knife held high. He knew John was somewhere nearby. The sound of footsteps on the rotting wood was no illusion. He could feel the old man's presence, like a predator sensing its prey in the darkness. John, meanwhile, moved quietly through a secret passage that connected the barn to the field. He had left the wooden house as soon as he heard the truck revving up in part one, knowing that Carlos wouldn't give up easily. He wasn't in a rush. His calmness was forged from years in special forces, where every step was a calculated move. He paused behind a large pile of dry hay, about a few dozen meters from the barn, his sharp gaze watching Carlos charge across the field like a wild beast. Rusty wasn't with him this time. He left the old dog at home, knowing that this chase required the kind of agility only he could provide. Carlos shouted, "I know you're here. Old man, come out and face me." He paused, breathing heavily, and turned his head to look around. Suddenly, his eyes caught a glimmer in the weak moonlight, a small piece of metal lying among the dry grass. He knelt down, picked it up, and his heart skipped a beat. It was an old bullet, its brass casing rusted, but still bearing the markings of the U.S. military. He clenched it tightly in his hand, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. You really are a soldier, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice trembling. He stood up, shouting louder, "You're a Special Forces soldier, right? I'm not afraid of you." John, from behind a pile of dry grass, heard Carlos's scream. He smirked slightly, not a cheerful smile, but the grin of someone who knows their enemy is digging their own grave. He had deliberately left that bullet behind, along with the badge and the map in the shed clues he wanted Carlos to find. He didn't need to hide his past anymore. He wanted the guy to know, wanted him to be afraid. He moved to another position, as quiet as a ghost, approaching another underground hideout he had dug long ago, camouflaged with dry grass and red dirt. Luis and Miguel rushed out from the warehouse at the sound of Carlos's shout. "Boss, where you?" Luis called out, his voice urgent. Miguel, clutching his broken wrist, staggered behind, mumbling, "I swear I don't want to do this anymore." They approached Carlos, finding him standing in the field, gripping a bullet tightly. Luis frowned. "What's going on, boss?" Carlos held up the bullet, his voice trailing off. "He's a Special Forces soldier, Luis. He's killed people, he's fought. We've messed with the wrong guy." Miguel stepped back, his face pale. "I told you from the start, we need to pull out." But Carlos didn't listen. He turned his head, his wild eyes scanning the field. "I don't care who he is. I'm going to kill him right now." He charged toward the pile of dry grass where John had just left, his knife held high. He stabbed fiercely into grass, tearing it apart, but there was no one there. He roared, turning back to Luis and Miguel. "You guys, search! He's here, I know it." Luis shook his head, his voice tense. "Boss, we can't do this. He knows what we're up to before we even do." At that moment, a small thump echoed from below Carlos's feet. He jumped, bent down, and before he could react, a cloud of smoke erupted from another trap that John had set. He coughed violently, swinging his knife wildly, and stumbled backward. Luis and Miguel rushed in, but the smoke enveloped all three of them, making them cough uncontrollably, their eyes stinging. "Damn it, not again!" Carlos shouted, his voice breaking. He tripped, the knife slipping from his hand, and in his panic, he heard another sound, slow, steady footsteps coming from behind the pile of dry grass. John stepped out of the shadows, neither fast nor slow, like a ghost materializing. He stood about 10 meters away from Carlos, the moonlight illuminating his silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He held no weapon. He didn't need one. "You want to face me, don't you?" he said, his voice gravelly yet clear in the still night. "Then come here. But I warn you, you won't like the outcome." Carlos, coughing through the smoke, struggled to get up, grabbing the knife with his left hand. He looked at John, his eyes a mix of fear and madness. Who are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Luis and Miguel stepped back, their faces pale. "Boss, no!" Luis yelled, but Carlos didn't listen. He lunged forward, the knife aimed straight at John, screaming, "I'm going to kill you!" John leaned to the side, easily dodging the stab, then seized Carlos's wrist, twisting it hard. A loud crack echoed as Carlos's left hand broke, and he collapsed to the ground, screaming in pain. Luis and Miguel stood frozen, not daring to move. John looked down at Carlos, his gaze cold yet calm. "You want to know who I am?" he said, his voice dropping. "You'll find out soon enough." He turned his back and walked into the darkness, leaving Carlos crumpled on the ground, weeping in pain and humiliation. The field behind the barn on John Carver's farm now lay shrouded in a chilling silence after the final scream of Carlos El Toro Mendoza. He collapsed on the ground, his left hand just broken by John and their face off. His right hand, already fractured, dangled uselessly aside, his face smeared with blood and dirt, and his once manic gaze now reduced to sheer pain and humiliation. His dagger lay discarded on the dry grass a few feet away, the steel blade glinting faintly under the weak moonlight. Luis and Miguel stood not far off, their faces pale, frozen in place after witnessing John take down their leader with a swift, decisive move. John Carver stood there, his lean frame solid and unwavering like a statue, his icy blue eyes fixed on Carlos, showing no sign of hesitation. Who are you?" Carlos groaned, his voice trailing off, tears mingling with blood streaming from his nose. He struggled to lift his head, but his body was too weak. He could only kneel there, gasping like a wounded animal on the brink of death. John didn't answer right away. He bent down, picked up Carlos's dagger, and twirled in his hand as if assessing an old toy. "You want to know who I am?" he finally spoke, his voice hoarse yet clear in the stillness of the night. "You've seen enough to guess, haven't you?" He threw the dagger to the ground, the blade embedding itself into the grass right in front of Carlos, making him flinch. Luis took a step forward, his voice trembling. You were a Special Forces soldier, weren't you? The badge, the map, the bullet, we found all of it." He looked at John, his eyes a mix of fear and curiosity, as if he wanted to confirm what he had suspected since discovering the strange signs in the warehouse. Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, took another step back, mumbling, "I told you from the start we messed with the wrong guy. He's not an ordinary person." John glanced at Luis, a hint of cold humor in his gaze. "Smart move," he said, his voice deepening. But knowing now is too late, Carlos, in pain, roared, "You think you won, old man? I'll be back, and I'll bring the whole gang with me to burn this farm to the ground." He struggled to get up, but with both arms broken, he could only fall face first into the dirt, groaning, "Damn it, I'm going to kill you." John stepped closer, bending down to look Carlos straight in the eye. "You can try," he said, his voice steady yet menacing, "but you won't live to see that day." He stood up straight, turned his back, and walked toward the barn, leaving Carlos crumpled on the ground, weeping in despair. Luis rushed over to support Carlos, pulling him up with the last bit of strength he had left. "Boss, enough!" he shouted, his voice urgent. "We have to go right now. He's not going to kill us, but if we stay, I swear we won't make it out alive." Miguel nodded frantically, his face pale. "Let's go, boss. He's a monster. We can't win this." Carlos, though humiliated, had no strength left to resist. He let Luis and Miguel help him toward the truck, his feet dragging through the dry grass, his groans blending with the sounds of the night wind. John stepped into the warehouse through the back door, his eyes scanning the tactical map that Carlos had torn down. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He knew Carlos had seen enough to understand he was a former Special Forces soldier, someone who had survived battles that these thugs couldn't even begin to imagine. But he didn't reveal everything. He wanted them to be afraid, to guess, to crumble under that fear. He walked over to a corner of the warehouse, lifted a piece of old wood, revealing a small secret stash where he had hidden the gang's goods since they had first left. He didn't care about the merchandise. He just wanted them gone from his land. Outside, Diego and Paco heard Carlos's scream from the field. Diego, clutching his painfully injured leg, turned to Paco, his voice trembling. "The boss is done for, right? That old man, he killed the boss." Paco, with a wounded leg from the underground tunnel, staggered to his feet. "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out. Let's go." The two of them limped toward the truck, where Luis and Miguel were helping Carlos into the back seat. Luis slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and the headlights swept across the field one last time. "Get in the truck, hurry," he shouted, and Diego and Paco jumped in, ignoring their pain. The truck sped away, the roar of the engine shattering the silence of the Texas night. Carlos, huddled in the back seat with a broken arm cradled against his chest, muttered, That monster. I'll be back." But his voice was weak, lacking any conviction. Luis glanced in the rear-view mirror, looking at Carlos with disappointment in his eyes. "Boss, we're not going back." He won. Diego, sitting next to him, nodded. "I swear I'll never set foot in that hellhole again." Paco and Miguel remained silent, their faces smeared with smoke and blood, their spirits completely shattered. John stepped out of the shed, standing under moonlight, watching the truck fade into the distance. He didn't chase after it. He didn't need to. He had shown them enough to make sure they wouldn't dare come back, at least not for a long while. He turned back inside, and Rusty ran out to greet him on the porch, his tail gently thumping against the wooden floor. He bent down and stroked its head. "They're gone now, Rusty," he said, his voice dropping. "But I know that guy. He'll be back, and when he does, we'll show him what it really costs." He stepped into the house, closed the door behind him, and the flickering oil lamp cast a dim light on his figure, a frail old man, yet carrying the strength of a warrior who had never stopped fighting. The Texas sky was just beginning to brighten, the first rays of sunlight streaming over the parched fields, casting a soft golden hue over John Carver's farm. The long, chaotic night was over. Carlos El Toro Mendoza and his gang had retreated in disgrace, leaving behind the echoes of groans, swirling smoke, and the chilling reminder of John's mysterious power. Their truck faded into the distance on the dirt road, but John knew this wasn't the end. He stood on the porch of his wooden house, his hand stroking the head of Rusty, his loyal old dog, his icy blue gaze fixed on the horizon. "They'll be back, Rusty," he murmured, his voice rough yet resolute. "And this time, I'm going to end it." John walked into the house, opening the old wooden box on the shelf where he kept mementos from the past. Military badges, tactical maps, and a stopwatch that had long stopped ticking. But this time, he wasn't pulling them out to reminisce about his days in the Special Forces. He reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out a small device, a homemade signal transmitter, simple yet effective, something he had prepared long ago to communicate with someone he trusted. He pressed a button, a short signal beeped, then he set it down on the table and sat back in the old wooden chair. He didn't need to say anything. The recipient would understand. This was the final step in the plan he had quietly crafted since Carlos and his henchmen first set foot on the farm. A few dozen miles away, in a small office in a town near the border, a middle-aged man in a sheriff's uniform named Hank Dawson sat at his desk, a cold cup of coffee in hand. The soft beep from the signal receiver on the desk startled him. He picked it up, glanced at the flashing screen, and smirked slightly. "John, my old friend," he murmured in a deep voice. "I know you didn't call just to say hi." Hank and John had served together in the military decades ago, before Hank became a cop and John chose a life of seclusion. This signal was a sign they had agreed upon long ago for when John needed help not to fight, but to clean up. Hank stood up, put on his police hat, and called over the radio, "You guys get ready. We've got a situation at the Carver farm. Bring the team. Hurry up." He knew John wasn't the type to call for help. If he sent a signal, it meant everything was in his hands, and the police just needed to come in and wrap things up. He jumped into the patrol car, leading a convoy of 3 other vehicles, speeding straight toward the farm with dust flying everywhere on the dirt road. Meanwhile, about 10 miles away, Carlos's truck swayed on the road. Inside, the atmosphere was as heavy as a funeral. Carlos huddled in the back seat, both arms broken, his face pale and his eyes vacant. Luis was behind the wheel, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and stress. Diego, Paco, and Miguel sat in the back, some hugging their legs, others clutching their arms, no one daring to say a word. The initial bravado they had felt had vanished after a series of traps and a disastrous face-off earlier. But Carlos, despite the pain and humiliation, had not given up. "You think I'm done, huh?" he muttered, his voice weak but filled with rage. "I'll be back, bringing the whole gang with me. That old man is going to die." Luis glanced in the rear-view mirror, shaking his head. "Boss, we can't do this. The guy's a Special Forces soldier. He knows what we're up to before we even realize it. We're done for." Diego nodded, his voice trembling. "I swear I'm never going back to that hellhole again. He's a monster." Paco, his leg injured from the underground tunnel, groaned. "Me too. I just want to go home." Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, muttered, "I said it from the start, we messed with the wrong guy." But Carlos wasn't listening. He clenched his fists, even though every movement sent sharp pain through him. "You guys are cowards. I'll show you what I'm capable of." John, from inside the house, heard the distant sound of an engine that wasn't Carlos's truck, but the familiar wail of a police siren. He stood up, stepped out onto the porch, his eyes fixed on the dirt road. He knew Hank was coming, and he also knew Carlos would be back not today, but soon enough. He had let them live, not out of pity, but because he wanted them to lead the police right to the moment, right to the place. Their cargo, those bags of illegal goods, still lay hidden in the secret basement beneath the warehouse, and John had arranged for it to become the final piece of evidence. Hank's patrol car was the first to arrive, followed by two others, the red and blue lights sweeping across the field. Hank jumped out, walked over to John, and shook his hand with a forced smile. "John, my old friend, getting into trouble again?" he said, his tone teasing yet respectful. John nodded slightly, his gaze steady. "Not trouble, Hank. Just cleaning up. They were here last night, left some stuff behind. I'm just holding on to it for them." Hank furrowed his brow, then burst into laughter. "You haven't changed a bit. Where are they?" John pointed toward the dirt road. "They've left, but I bet they'll be back. Their stuff is down at the barn. If you want to catch them, just wait." Hank nodded, turning back to signal the police team. "You guys, get ready. Set up an ambush. We got company coming." The police team quickly spread out, hiding around the farm behind a chicken coop, near the barn. Along the fence, everything was marked out by John beforehand. On the tactical map, he had signaled to Hank. John stepped into the warehouse, lifting the old board to reveal a secret bunker. There, untouched, were bags of contraband, like a final trap, waiting for Carlos to walk right in. He turned back to the porch, sat down in a chair, and stroked Rusty's head. "Now we just wait," he murmured. The audience would feel that this was the beginning of the resolution, where John didn't need to fire a shot, yet still held all the cards, steering everything according to the plan from the start. The morning sunlight gradually blanketed the Texas fields, melting away the biting chill the night before. John Carver's farm now lay in an eerie peace, but that tranquility was merely a facade. John sat on a wooden chair on the porch, stroking Rusty's head, his sharp gaze fixed on the dirt road, where Hank Dawson's police squad had set up an ambush. About 10 officers were hiding behind the chicken coop, near the barn, and along the fence, guns ready but unloaded, waiting for John's signal. He didn't need to fire a shot, didn't need any bloodshed. His plan was for Carlos El Toro Mendoza and his goons to walk right into the final trap. John stood up, walked into the shed, and checked the secret stash where he hid the bags of illegal goods of the gang. They were still there, untouched like the perfect bait. He lifted the old wooden board covering the stash just enough to keep it from being too obvious, but still accessible for anyone who searched thoroughly. He knew Carlos would be back, not today, but soon. The guy's stubbornness and greed were things John had calculated ever since the henchmen first set foot here. He stepped outside, seeing Hank standing near the patrol car, their eyes meeting in a brief, not a silent understanding between those who had faced life and death together. Not far away, on the dirt road leading into town, Carlos's truck came to a shaky stop in front of an old gas station. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, like a mobile prison. Carlos sat in the back seat, both arms broken, cradled against his chest, his face pale from pain and sleeplessness. Luis, the driver, turned off the engine and looked back at Carlos with tired eyes. Diego, Paco, and Miguel huddled in the back, none of them daring to speak after their disastrous failure earlier. But Carlos, despite his humiliation, refused to give up. "You think I'm done," he muttered, his voice weak yet filled with rage. "I'll be back, bringing the whole gang with me. That old man is going to die, and I'm getting my stuff back." Luis sighed and shook his head. "Boss, we're out of steam. That guy's a special ops soldier. He's got a whole system backing him up. We're done for." Diego nodded, his voice trembling. "I agree. I'm not going back to that godforsaken farm." Paco, with his injured leg, groaned. "Me neither. I just want to go home and get some sleep." Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, muttered, "I said it from the start, he's a monster." But Carlos wasn't listening. He slammed his left hand down on the table, even though every movement sent a jolt of pain through him. "You guys are cowards. I'll call my crew from El Paso. That old man can't take on the whole gang." He pulled his phone from his pocket with a trembling left hand, dialed a number, his voice gravelly. "Hey, Rico, I need you guys up here right now. Bring guns, knives, everything you've got. There's an old man at the farm near the border that needs to be dealt with. My stuff is there. You need to get back for me." He paused, breathing heavily, then shouted, "Hurry up, you idiots!" He threw the phone down on the floor of the car and turned to Luis. "You drive. We're heading back right now." Luis shook his head, but the wild look in Carlos's eyes was enough to scare him. He started the car, turning it around toward the farm. Back at the farm, John heard the distant sound of engines. This time, it wasn't just a truck. There were also motorcycles and other cars. He smirked slightly, a cold smile creeping across his weathered face. "They're faster than I thought," he muttered to Rusty. He moved over to Hank, who was hiding behind a chicken coop, and whispered, "They're here. More than last time. The stuff is in the barn for them to find. Then you take care of the rest." Hank nodded and signaled over the radio. "You guys, get ready. Don't shoot unless I say so. Let them dig their own grave." Carlos's truck rolled in first, followed by two motorcycles and a black SUV. Kicking up a cloud of red dust as they came to a stop in front of the farm gate, Carlos jumped out, his left hand gripping a brand new handgun he had just taken from his crew, his wild eyes scanning the wooden house. Luis, Diego, Paco, and Miguel, his old henchmen, stumbled out, their faces filled with reluctance. Behind them were 5 new guys from El Paso, tall and menacing, armed with guns and knives, ready for a fight. "You guys, tear this place apart." Carlos shouted, pointing toward the barn. "The goods are in there, I know it. Where's that old man? I'll blow his head off." The gang members rushed into the warehouse, while Luis and Diego reluctantly followed. John stood inside, peering through the window's crack, his gaze calm yet sharp. He watched as one of the goons lifted a piece of old wood and shouted, "Boss, over here! The goods are here." Carlos dashed forward, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the bags in the basement. "I knew it. Grab them, quick." He turned around and yelled, "Old man, where are you? Come out, and I'll show you who's the winner." But John didn't budge. He waited, knowing the moment had arrived. Hank, from his hiding spot, signaled over the radio, "Now!" The police team surged forward, guns aimed directly at the gang. "Drop your weapons. This is the police." Hank shouted, his voice echoing across the field. The gang members froze, a few of them reaching for their guns, but the sound of police weapons being cocked made them hesitate. Carlos turned around, his eyes wide with panic as he looked at the encircling police. "What the hell? How are they here?" he yelled, his gun trembling in his hand. Luis threw the knife to the ground and raised his hands. "I surrender. Don't shoot." Diego and Paco followed suit, their faces pale. Miguel knelt down, mumbling, "I knew it. We're done for." The new guys from El Paso, though tough, didn't dare resist when they saw they were outnumbered. Carlos stood frozen, his gun slipping from his hand, his vacant stare watching Hank approach to cuff him. "You've lost, Carlos," Hank said, his voice cold. "Your goods are the evidence. Take them away." John stepped out of the wooden house, standing on the porch, taking in the scene before him. He hadn't fired a shot, hadn't spilled any blood. He had managed to take down the entire gang solely through wit and careful planning from the start. Hank glanced over at John, forcing a smile. "You're really something, John, just like the old days." John nodded, his gaze steady. "It's just a job, Hank." The morning sunlight blanketed John Carver's farm, illuminating the chaotic remnants from the night before. The earth had collapsed from the underground tunnel. Dry grass was scattered by nylon nets, and wisps of smoke lingered from the traps. But now, everything was over. Carlos El Toro Mendoza stood in the field, his hands cuffed behind his back, his vacant gaze fixed on Hank Dawson's police team, escorting his henchmen to the patrol car. Luis, Diego, Paco, and Miguel, along with 5 goons from El Paso, hung their heads in shame, completely stripped of their will after being caught red-handed. The bags of contraband, the final pieces of evidence, were being pulled from the hidden tunnel beneath the barn, sealed, and loaded into the police vehicle. John stood on the porch of the wooden house, stroking Rusty's head, his icy blue eyes observing everything with the calmness of a man who had calculated every move from the very beginning. Hank Dawson stepped up to Carlos, radio in hand, his voice cold. "You're done, Carlos. Smuggling, attacking civilians. That's enough to put you away for life." Carlos turned his head, his eyes blazing with anger as he glanced over at John standing off in the distance. "That old man," he muttered, his voice weak but filled with hatred. "Who is he? How did you guys show up right on time?" Hank smirked, not answering right away. He signaled for an officer to push Carlos into the car, then turned back to John, forcing a smile. "You're taking me back to the old days, John. No gunfire, no bloodshed, and still taking down the whole crew. Impressive." John nodded, his gaze unwavering. "No need for guns when they're digging their own graves," he said, his voice rough but firm. He stepped off the porch, moving toward Hank, with Rusty trailing behind, his tail gently thumping against the ground. "They came back just like I figured. You just had to show up at the right time." Hank let out a hearty laugh, slapping John on the shoulder. "Right time, huh? You signaled since last night. I knew you had it all planned out. That bunker under the shed was intentionally left for them to find, wasn't it?" John gave a slight smirk, the cold smile he had worn throughout the story. "A tasty bait needs to be placed just right, Hank." The police finished escorting them. Luis, Diego, Paco, and Miguel were shoved into the first patrol car, their faces smeared with smoke and dirt from the trap, looking utterly miserable. Luis glanced at John before being pushed into the car, his eyes filled with regret. "I knew he wasn't just some ordinary guy," he muttered, his voice low enough for Diego to hear. Diego nodded, groaning. "I swear I'll never mess with this crazy farm again." Paco, his foot still aching from the underground tunnel, just hung his head, saying nothing. Miguel, cradling his broken wrist, mumbled, "I told you from the start, he's a monster." The car door slammed shut, cutting off their complaints. Carlos and his crew from El Paso were escorted into the second vehicle. He no longer screamed or threatened. The arrogance he once had vanished after the humiliating face-off earlier. Now, with his hands cuffed, he was just a shadow of the kingpin who had confidently walked into the ranch. A tall, scar-faced henchman mumbled to Carlos as they were pushed into the van. "Boss, where did these cops come from? How did they know?" Carlos turned his head, his eyes empty as he looked at him. "That old man," he called them. "We've been set up from the start." He hung his head, saying nothing more as the police locked the van doors. John stood there, watching the scene unfold, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, where he kept the tactical map that Carlos had discovered but never fully understood. He didn't need to lift a finger, didn't need to pull the trigger. He had turned the farm into a chessboard, and Carlos, along with his henchmen, were the pawns willingly stepping into the losing square. The goods in the secret stash weren't just bait. They were the evidence Hank needed to take down the entire gang. Without firing a single shot, John turned to Hank, his voice dropping. "Are you done with your business? I still need to fix the fence." Hank let out a hearty laugh, shaking his head. "All done, my friend. These guys won't bother you anymore." The police team began to pull back, the roar of the patrol cars echoing as they left the farm, taking Carlos and his goons with them. Red dust swirled chaotically on the dirt road, gradually dissipating under the sunlight. John stepped into the barn, checking the now-empty secret bunker. He picked up an old plank, placing it back in its original position, as if nothing had ever happened. He left no trace, not out of fear of being discovered, but because that was how he operated since his days in the Special Forces. Clean, tidy, and without excess. Hank was the last to leave. He got into the patrol car, but before closing the door, he turned back to look at John. "You're not really thinking about coming back to work with me, are you? A talent like yours sitting here fixing fences would be such a waste." John stood under the porch, gently stroking Rusty's head, and shook his head slightly. "I like my peace, Hank, but if they come back, you know where to find me." Hank let out a big laugh, closed the car door, and the patrol car finally sped away, leaving the farm in its usual silence. John walked into the house and sat down on the old wooden chair. The oil lamp had long since gone out, leaving only the sunlight streaming through the crack in the window. He took the stopwatch out of the wooden box, turning it over in his hands, his gaze distant. He didn't take pride in this victory. To him, it was just a job that needed to be done, a part of the life he chose to protect this land. Rusty lay at his feet, his tail gently thumping against the floor, as if sensing that peace had returned. But deep in John's eyes, there was still a glimmer not of satisfaction, but of vigilance. He knew Carlos wouldn't be getting out of prison anytime soon, but there were plenty of others like him out there, and if they came, he would be ready. He set down his watch, stood up, and stepped outside, grabbing the old hammer. "Let's go, Rusty," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's work to be done." He started fixing the fence, as if no thugs had ever crossed this way, as if no cops or contraband had ever shown up. The midday sun poured down over the Texas fields, casting a brilliant, warm glow over John Carver's farm, as if it were banishing the shadows and chaos of the night before. Hank Dawson's police team had long since departed, taking with them Carlos El Toro Mendoza and his crew Luis, Diego, Paco, Miguel, along with a gang from El Paso, leaving behind the usual tranquility of this land. The bags of contraband had been sealed and taken away as evidence, and the remnants of the underground traps, nylon nets, and smoke were now just faint smudges on the dry grass and red earth. John stood in the middle of the field, holding the old hammer he had used to fix the fence, his icy blue eyes scanning the scene before him, as if conducting one last check to see if everything had returned to order. Rusty, the loyal old dog, ran over to stand beside him, his tail gently thumping against the ground, ears perked up as if to say he felt the peace too. John bent down and stroked his head, his voice hoarse yet soft. "It's all over now, isn't it? They won't bother us anymore." He straightened up, driving the hammer into the newly repaired fence, the straight, sturdy post standing tall, like a symbol of his determination to protect this place. He didn't rush back inside. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, letting the warm sunlight soak into his weathered skin. Inside the wooden house, everything remained the same. A small table with a broken radio, a tattered notebook, and a wooden box holding mementos from the days in the Special Forces. John walked in, set the hammer down on the floor, and sat on the old wooden chair he had occupied throughout the story from the moment Carlos first appeared, to when he outsmarted the guy, and ultimately led to the entire gang's capture. The chair creaked under his weight, but it stood strong, just like him. Rusty lay at his feet, yawning widely, his sad eyes closing as if he too wanted to rest after a long night. John looked through the window, his gaze fixed on a vast field stretching out before him. The dry grass swayed in the wind, sunlight shining on it like a peaceful painting he had chosen to live out his remaining days. He didn't say a word, but the corners of his mouth curled up into a small smile, not one of pride or victory, but of simple contentment. He had defended this land, not with guns, not with violence, but with wisdom and patience, just as he had told Hank. No need for guns when they're digging their own graves. The memories of last night flashed through his mind. Carlos's scream as he twisted his arm, the sound of the fake military loudspeaker echoing in the distance, and a bewildered look on the guy's face as he was handcuffed. But he didn't let those thoughts linger for long. For John, it was just part of the job he did to keep this farm as his home, a place where he could live without looking over his shoulder every single day. He took the stopwatch out of the wooden box, turned it over in his hands, the sunlight glinting off the rusty metal surface. He didn't need it to run any more time. For him was just moments of peace like this. Rusty let out a soft whine, lifting his head to look at him, as if asking something. John leaned down, gently stroking his head again. "Are you hungry, Rusty?" he said, his voice deep but carrying a rare warmth. He stood up, walked over to the small kitchen corner, grabbed an old can of food from the shelf, opened it, and poured it into Rusty's bowl. The old dog slowly got his feet, eating at a leisurely pace, his tail wagging lightly against the floor as a thank you. John sat back in his chair, watching Rusty eat, his gaze softening a bit, no longer sharp like when he faced Carlos, but filled with the tenderness of a man who had found peace with his only companion. Outside, the fields were still and quiet, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere in the distance. John leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his gaze drifting back to the window. He wasn't thinking about Carlos or the police or the traps and plans he had set in motion. To him, it was all behind him, like a fleeting breeze across this field. He was only thinking about the days ahead, fixing the fence, planting some more dry grass, and sitting here with Rusty, as if nothing had ever happened. But deep down, John knew that this peace wouldn't last forever. Carlos might be caught, but out there in the world, there were plenty of others like him driven by greed, ready to invade his land. He wasn't afraid of them. He was just cautious, just like he had always been since his days in the Special Forces. He pulled out the tactical map from his jacket pocket, spread it out on the table, his finger gliding over the red markings for the chicken coop, the barn, the fields, a reminder that this farm was not just a home, but his last fortress. He folded it back up, placed it in the wooden box, and closed the lid, as if sealing a chapter of his story. John stood up and stepped out onto the porch once more, with Rusty following closely behind. He settled into a wooden chair placed outside, not the one from inside, but an older one, weathered by years of sun and rain. He gazed out the fields, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines in his silver hair. For the first time in the story, he smiled a genuine smile, free of coldness or hidden meanings, just the simple joy of a man content with what he has. Rusty lay down beside him, resting his head on John's leg, his eyes closing in peacefulness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" John said, his voice deep and resonant, like he was talking to an old friend. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and red earth, and in that moment, everything seemed to pause. No gangs, no traps, no cops, just John, Rusty, and the sprawling field ahead. The audience would feel that this was the moment the story completely cooled down, a gentle yet profound ending, where John Carver found the peace he had fought so hard to hold on to. The midday sun gradually softened as it tilted toward the west, stretching the shadows across the Texas fields surrounding John Carver's farm. John sat on an old wooden chair on the porch, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his deep blue eyes gazing out at the vast expanse before him. Rusty, his loyal old dog, rested his head on John's leg, eyes half closed, breathing steadily as if drifting into a short nap. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the familiar scent of dry grass and red earth fragrances that John had chosen to embrace throughout the years after leaving the Special Forces. Everything was peaceful now, as if Carlos El Toro Mendoza, his gang, or Hank Dawson's police squad had never intruded into his life. John gently tilted his head, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines in his tousled gray hair. He didn't dwell much on the tense standoff, the series of traps that had sent the gang into a frenzy, or the swift arrest by the police. To him, it was just part of life, a job that needed to be done to protect this land, nothing more, nothing less. He offered a small, warm smile, the kind he reserved for Rusty, a rare smile devoid of coldness or hidden meanings, simply the contentment of a man who had found his peace. He bent down, stroking Rusty's head once more, his hoarse voice breaking the silence. "You're the best friend I've got, you know that?" Rusty let out a soft whine, his tail gently thumping against the wooden floor, as if in response. John stood up and walked over the fence he had just repaired, his hand brushing against the sturdy posts. He looked at them, A hint of pride in his eyes, not from defeating Carlos, but from the little things like this. A fence standing strong, a peaceful day, and a loyal dog by his side. From inside the house, John brought the old wooden box out onto the porch and set it down on the floor next to the chair. He opened the lid and looked at the mementos inside: a military badge, a tactical map, a stopwatch, and a rusty bullet that Carlos had found. He picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands as the sunlight glinted off the faded eagle emblem. Memories of his days in special forces flashed through his mind: gunfire, smoke, and battles he once thought would never end. But now, they were just distant memories, no longer haunting him, no longer keeping him awake at night. He placed the badge back in the box and took out the map, spreading it out across his lap. The red markings on the map of the chicken coop, the barn, and the fields were proof of the plan he had executed perfectly. He didn't need to brag, didn't need anyone else to know, just him, and Rusty was enough. He folded the map, placed it in the box, and then took out the stopwatch one last time. He pressed a button, but it didn't start at stop long ago, just like he had stopped living in the past. He smiled, put the stopwatch back in the box, and closed the lid, sealing everything up like a story that had come to an end. John sat down in the chair, his gaze drifting out to the fields. He didn't say a word, just watched the dry grass swaying in the wind, the sunlight gradually fading as the afternoon slipped away. Rusty lifted his head, looked at him, then lay back down, resting his head on John's leg as if to affirm that he would be there, by his side, no matter what happened. John stroked his head, murmuring, "This land is ours, Rusty, and we'll protect it." It wasn't a threat or a declaration. It was simply a straightforward truth he had proven through every challenge. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together, his gaze distant yet not heavy. He wasn't thinking about Carlos, nor about those who might come in the future. For him, today was enough a peaceful day, a day when he could sit here with Rusty and forget everything that had happened. He smiled again, a genuine smile, soft and warm, like the late afternoon sun shining down on the fields. The wind blew through, carrying the whispered dry grass, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. John gently closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to Rusty, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Rusty let out a soft whine, his tail wagging lightly, and the two of them sank into tranquility of the Texas afternoon, as if everything that had come before was just a fleeting dream. Thank you for joining us on the journey of John Carver, a man who doesn't need a gun, relying only on his intellect and unyielding would protect his land. From clever traps to the final showdown with the police, John has shown us that true strength lies in resilience and determination. Are you feeling inspired by him? Hit that like button to honor that spirit. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on more heartwarming journeys like this one. We truly appreciate your support. It fuels us to continue sharing more meaningful stories. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon.